Belfast to Bordeaux. We arrive in Belfast and check into the Europa Hotel. This place had the dubious honour of being the most bombed hotel in Europe and had suffered multiple attacks since it was built in the early 70s. It had sentry boxes outside and a barbed wire barrier between the front of the hotel and the road. Still, who'd want to bomb us, apart from Holly? The civil unrest in Northern Ireland since the late 60s meant that bands were reluctant to visit. There were regular reports on the news of bombings and death, so it was understandable that people weren't lining up to catch the ferry over. The Northern Irish had been starved of visit musicians, so anybody who did venture there was given the warmest of welcomes, and we were no exception. During the 80s, the King's Hall in Belfast was associated with hosting boxing matches, and the atmosphere when we arrived for the show was tangible. The ambient noise from the hall before the show was definitely a few notches above usual, and the roar that greeted us when we hit the stage was enough to knock you off your feet. You could always hear the girls screaming when the house lights went down, but you could hear the guys screaming too. Due to the spotlight that's shining in your face, you can't really see past the first 10 rows of people, so the noise comes from this mass of people that you know are there but are invisible. You can see the exits though, and if it looked packed by the exits, then you knew the show was full. Belfast was a sellout. This was the first show since Arsegate, and we didn't see Holly until a minute before the show. We would assemble behind Ped's red fist as the intro tape started, and there would be a brief nod of acknowledgement, and we'd run out and perform. This is how it would be for every show on the tour. The professional agreement was operational and proven a success. There was never a lot of banter between us and Holly on stage. We'd never see him at sound checks, and our paths would only cross in the dressing room, so the arrangement meant nothing had really changed. The gig was fantastic, and we rode the audience's wave of welcome all the way back to the hotel bar, where we smuggled in about a dozen fans to join us for a drink into the early hours. In the morning, we climbed aboard the bus and drove south to Dublin. We were returning to play at the RDS and were expecting another sellout and a welcome from 8,000 people up for the party. It wasn't sold out. In fact, it was a good few thousand short. We couldn't understand it, neither could the promoter. Just one of those things, I guess. We flew into Birmingham on Sunday morning for a show the following day at the NEC. We were greeted by a load of bored customs officers who decided we'd be the sport for that morning. I don't know if they were looking for anything specific or whether they just fancied having a poke around our smalls. I opened my bag and this is no cursory glance. He's unfolding me socks and taking everything out. 2 cases packed for an 8-week tour, and he's got the lot out on the counter. After he's emptied the cases, he fucks off to talk to someone and leaves me standing there. Is he thinking I'm going to start sweating or something? I shout him and he comes back over. Can I pack this shit away now? Have you got any drugs? No, I haven't. You must have some gear. Come on, where's the gear? Tell you what, mate, should we go in the back and you can have a look up my arse? He has no real desire to look at my round brown and lets me go. Quay and Paul were not so lucky and were both taken in the back and strip searched, and although both felt violated, I think Quay enjoyed it a little. What did they think they were going to find on a flight from Dublin? Hardly Bogota or Lima, is it? It's pretty laughable when you look at customs today. There's never anyone there. After Birmingham, we returned to London for a couple of days off before heading to Glasgow for the final gig in the UK. We played at the SEC and this wasn't a sellout either, which was a little worrying. The venue was pretty grim though. It was like playing in an underground car park. It didn't deter us from putting on a great show though, and those that were there were as enthusiastic as all Glaswegian audiences. After Glasgow, we headed back home for a few days off while the equipment travelled to Italy. The Italian leg began in Modena and moved on to Rome. The Palazzo del Sport in Rome was a big gig. When we arrived in the coach, we experienced the same thing we always did when arriving anywhere in Italy. Total chaos. The guy on the gate doesn't know you, doesn't know where you should park, can't find the key to the gate, can't speak English, doesn't know anyone who does. There's always something. Meanwhile, you're waiting outside with people banging on the bus going mental. Frankie! Bang, bang, bang. Frankie! It was like turning up at a football match. When we got inside the arena, I remember stopping at the side of the stage to catch a couple of minutes of Berlin, who'd just joined us in Europe. Caught in the light of the stage were what seemed like hundreds of coins flying through the air and the occasional large plastic bottle. When Berlin had finished, the curtain closed and one of the crew had to go around the stage with a brush sweeping the coins off the floor. 1 lira was worth fuck all, and even if you had a mound, there wouldn't be enough to buy a pizza. At our next show, we'd be on the end of a few missiles ourselves when we played in Florence. I had my video camera with me and decided to film the audience coming into the venue. You always see these time-lapse shots in rock documentaries, the excited running hordes all wanting to claim their spot at the front. We go down well and retire to the dressing room and await the call for the encore. I'd noticed a few things flying through the air, and when we got backstage, Jed showed me something that had flown inches past his head. It was the size of a lipstick and was sharp at one end. I think Mark had been hit by a coin and was being a bit over-dramatic and refusing to go back out, and Jed was lending support to that view. You can't let one or a couple of idiots spoil it for everyone else, can you? Well, that's easy for you to say. It didn't fucking hit you, did it? You're more arsed about your fucking video. Strop O'Toole in full flight. When the crowd want more, you got to give them more. Them's the rules. He eventually calmed down and begrudgingly returned to the stage and sulked his way through the encore. We travelled to Milan for our final Italian show and hit the road to Paris to play the Bercy. When the date had been booked, the promoter asked Tony what sort of venues we thought we could fill. Tony said possibly a Bercy and was told that we would do 2. The man knew his market. The 2 shows sold out in the morning and meant we'd be playing to 16,000 on each night. That's a big crowd. The Bercy is a huge venue with very steep sides, and when we performed The Power of Love that night, there were thousands of arms aloft holding lighters. It was a fantastic view from the stage and one I'll always remember. We were alternating between taking the odd flight and travelling on the bus. I quite liked the bus because if you were a little hungover, you could go back to bed in your bunk rather than having to hang around airports feeling like shit. We were accompanied on the bus a few times with the 2 hired guns in the support band. Steph and Greg were playing guitar and keys for Berlin and often travelled with us. This led to a serious cribbage outbreak on the tour bus. Steph and Greg both played and became additional members of the card school. The hours on the road would be filled playing in pairs or four-handed, and it made the time pass quickly. After one stop in Holland, we flew into Berlin to do what would be the first of many German shows. The Liverpool album had gone down really well, and where we'd witnessed some empty seats in previous venues, the German shows would all be full. As it was our first date in the country, we were greeted by some of the staff from Areola, who had always been our label there. There were a few familiar faces amongst their crew, but a new girl had started since our last visit, and she'd become very popular over the next week or 2. We do the gig and the label takes us out afterwards, and we end up in this great bar. The music's great, the beers are flowing, and everything is good. The new girl asks us if we'd like to buy any ecstasy. What the fuck is ecstasy? I'd never heard of it, and the Summer of Love was still over a year away. She explained that it's similar to MDMA, and Paul's ears prick up. He'd done MDMA before and was giving it the big thumbs up, so we bought some of these huge yellow tablets from the young lady. They were the size of Alka-Seltzers and not the easiest to swallow. I swallow one and wait for the good times to roll. An hour goes by and nothing's happening. I'm buzzing, but I think that it's probably down to the 5 or 6 beers I've had and the post-show adrenaline. I seek out Paul and ask him why nothing's happening. Have another, Nash, I've just had another 2. Classic Rutherford. Well, if Paul's had another 2, then I'll have another 1. I find a girl, purchase and pop. Nothing happens for a further 10 minutes, and then it hits me like a lorry. My legs suddenly feel like Pinocchio's and I'm very warm all of a sudden. I go outside to get some air and start throwing up. Ian Jeffries, who was actually tour managing Berlin on this tour, came out to check on me and could tell I was out the game. He hails a cab and installs me and gives the cab driver the hotel address. 5 minutes later, I'm back at the hotel and starting to feel a little different. I get my key and head to the room, still feeling a bit nauseous but improving. After 5 more minutes in my room, washing my face and trying to straighten out, I start to feel this new drug doing its thing. Within 30 minutes, I am totally vibing and all feelings of sickness have gone. I want to go back out, but I don't know where I've been. No mobile phones back then. I decided to have a beer out the minibar and ride it out alone. I spent the next 3 hours watching German TV. What a waste of a trip. Everyone was back at the bar, probably having a top buzz, and I was stuck in a hotel watching an episode of Dallas dubbed in German. We left Berlin the next morning on the bus, and our two American guests were freaked out to see the Berlin Wall. This was the 80s, when the West feared the East, and Steph and Greg saw this checkpoint as the front line. After Hanover, we skipped out to Belgium to play the Forest National again. On this tour, we had an accountant travelling with us taking care of the money. He had a friend in Brussels who was a diamond dealer and could sell us discounted diamonds. He'd met her when he was working for Diana Ross. If the diamonds were good enough for Diana, then they were good enough for my missus. Claire was due to meet me there, so we decided we'd meet the woman before the sound check. We meet in one of the dressing rooms at the venue, and she emptied out a bag of diamonds in front of Claire and I and starts describing the rocks, given the size and weight. We haven't got a clue but trust the woman's judgment. We ended up buying a 4-carat one for about £1,000, which we're told is about half price, and before she goes I ask her to have a look at Claire's engagement ring. A very poor stone, came the verdict. Cheers, love, you just shown me right up. It might not be in Diana Ross's league, but give me a break. The show in Brussels was rocking. We went out into the arena afterwards and there were holes in the floor where it had given weight under the weight of dancing feet. At one point the mixing desk nearly went over. When we got to Frankfurt I had to fly home for the day. Claire had received a bad smear result and would need an operation. I took a very early flight out and met her at the hospital. The operation was a success, but we were informed that there might be a chance that Claire wouldn't be able to have children. That was bad news to hear, but the fact that she'd snuffed out cancer and was alive diminished any disappointment. Anyway, what do doctors know? I flew back to Germany and joined the guys for the show in Munich before moving on to what would be the biggest show of the tour at the Westfalenhalle in Dortmund. We'd filmed one of these huge TV extravaganzas there and were looking forward to playing the 15,000 capacity arena. The official capacity was smaller than that of the Bercy, but this turned out to be the biggest ever single audience we played for because we had 2,000 extra people in. You couldn't see the exits, and when the crowds were illuminated by the white blinders on the front of our stage, it was an awesome sight. An uninterrupted sea of smiling faces, all going mental. Tremendous show. We arrived in Hamburg and our female friend from the record company came out to visit with a couple of others from the label. She brings a load of her Alka-Seltzers with her too. We have a night off in Hamburg and the crew are also off, so 22 Alka-Seltzers are popped and we head out into the night. We ended up in a disco and Mark, Jed, Paul and I were sitting in a booth. Paul orders a bottle of cold water and when it arrives he opens it and takes a big mouthful. He then leans across to Jed, plants his lips on his forehead and spits the water all over Jed's face. Jed's mesmerised and frozen to the spot. There's a 10-second pause before he opens his eyes and looks at Paul and says, "Do it again." Paul obliges and Mark and I think we're missing out. We take turns and order more water. What must the waitress have thought? 4 guys taking turns to spit water at each other. 2 bottles of Peroni later, the table's swimming in the stuff. We've got eyes like saucers and are wetter than an otter's pocket. The next few German shows were in places that were not necessarily popular, but had lots of British forces stationed nearby. Kiel, Ludwigshafen and Saarbrücken were those gigs. I'd never heard of these places. We arrive in Saarbrücken a day early and decide to have a roam around the nearby shops. We come across this shop that's part fancy dress, part wizard's den, and we pop in for a mooch. They had an amazing selection of masks and we all got our wallets out. Ped bought a large plastic pig's head with an even bigger one that was supposed to be an Arab in a headdress and shades. Mark bought a baby's mask whose cheeks moved when the person wearing it talked. We go mad and buy at least a couple each and head back to the hotel to make a movie. I'd been filming a load of the gigs with the aid of volunteers. I knew there was never going to be a concert video, so I captured a load of stuff. As soon as the masks went on, the person got into character and started playing up for the camera. Any description of it would fall short, but imagine Ped standing at the hotel reception, wearing a huge Arab head and some false hands with bejeweled bony fingers, shouting at the receptionist, "Where is my room? Where are my sluts? Book me the whole floor. I have 15 Rolls Royces." Mark doing an impression of Tony Pope wearing the baby's mask and repeating the same sentence that he always directed at us. "It's fucking embarrassing, lads." I knew my description would fail. Sorry, I guess you had to be there. In recent years, when I've had a look at this footage, it never fails to kill me. It may surface one day, who knows. After Saarbrücken, we played Stuttgart and Wurzburg, making 3 gigs in 3 days, and Holly lost his voice. It was following one of these shows that we were invited to a party at a local club and were ushered to a side room by a waitress who took our order. Paul ordered a vodka and a tequila. The waitress returned with a bottle of each. Looked like the booze was on the house. Paul suggests tequila slammers and orders up champagne. I have one to be polite, but I'm not going there. I'm not a tequila fan. Others are keener. Jed and Paul start smashing them away. When I leave the club an hour later, I attempt to get Jed in a cab with me, but he's in the fetal position on the pavement outside and doesn't want to move. Okay, cool. I go back to the hotel and crash out and get awoken sometime later by shouting. I can hear Paul shouting and sounding like he's having a row with someone, so I listen in for a bit. He's shouting and banging on a door, but I don't fancy getting involved. I tried to hear what he was saying, but he was too distant, and eventually I dropped off again. I get up the next morning feeling okay. As I walk out of my room, there's a chambermaid standing in front of an open room 4 doors down from me. Her face gives the impression that she's looking at a crime scene. She asks me, "This room your friend?" And I join her at the door. To my left is the door to the bathroom that is closed, but there is a huge hole in the middle of the door. A Paul-sized hole. I look through the hole and there is Wallace and Gromit everywhere but in the toilet. I mean everywhere. I walk into the room and Paul is face down in his pants and still wasted. We rouse him and get him out of there, and reparations are made with the management for the door. Paul would later explain the shouting and screaming. He'd gone into his bathroom and locked the door. Whilst in there, the light bulb had gone out and he couldn't see. He thought we'd locked him in and turned the light off, and that's what all the shouting was about. He kicked his way out of the bathroom. He was looking very sorry for himself. Jed didn't look the picture of health either. Zurich had to be postponed due to Holly losing his voice. It was supposed to have been the last gig, but extra dates had been added. The gig was rescheduled and we went back to London for a couple of days. We'd returned to play it 4 days later before heading to France to play Grenoble and Lille. Whilst back in London, there were discussions about us playing Saturday Live. It was a very popular show featuring comedians like Harry Enfield, Ben Elton, Stephen Fry and Hugh Laurie. It had a big audience and we were invited to perform Watching the Wildlife and another song. We were up for it. When we got back on tour, we were thinking about what would be our final TV appearance. We had an idea to play Relax, and when Holly finished his vocal intro, the music would stop and one of us would say, "We've heard you leaving, Holly." And that would be Peter Oxendale's cue to start playing Zippity Doo Dah, and we'd all join in. It was live TV and it would have been a memorable piece of television. Unfortunately, Holly got wind of it and smelled a rat, and he refused to perform. We returned to Rotterdam to do an extra show, and it would be Berlin's last performance with us. That meant there'd be pranks in store for Berlin. When they took to the stage, they didn't know that the lads were operating the spotlights. For the first song of the set, there were 3 spotlights dancing randomly all over the stage. We were all hooked up on the headphones and would put in our own cues. Light up Greg, light up Steph, light up the small flight case next to the curtain. We moved from spotlights to backstage where we had a blow-up doll hung from the neck about to be dangled over the heads from the truss. The audience start laughing as the doll descends. She is bounced all over the place for a couple of minutes until Steph manages to grab her leg and wrench her down. Her twin sister is being held up behind the amps and is headbanging and then gets thrown at the drum kit where she gets tangled up in the beat. During the sound check, we'd asked Pyro Al to rig up a couple of bombs under their drum riser. Every night they would play the big hit Take My Breath Away, and Terry Nunn would appear in the seats and walk up and down the aisles singing it. We thought that could do with improving. During the trip to the red light area to buy the blow-up dolls, we'd purchased a few other bits and pieces. We got a lovely crotchless panties stroke peephole bra combo in red with black lace and an electric blue curly wig. Who was going to wear them though? Quay volunteered and Paul got him ready. Terry goes out into the audience and the spotlight picks her out and she begins to slowly weave around the audience. She didn't get 4 lines in before another spotlight illuminates Quay following her route but dressed rather more sexily. The lacy combo had slipped on a treat and the blue wig looked fantastic under the jaunty beret, all topped off with suspenders and fishnet stockings tucked into Doc Marten boots. She is emoting into her radio microphone whilst he is miming into a banana. The pair of them shit themselves when Alan fires the first two bombs under the stage during the quietest moment of the song. She returns to the stage for the moody intro to their next song. Her routine was to climb on top of a 2-foot flight case and wave her arms about like a tortured soul, while Greg set up the atmosphere with swirling synths and plucking koto samples soaked in reverb. Her head's about 3 feet from the front of Ped's drum riser that was hidden behind the curtain. Mark and Ped get up there, and just as the huge, slow drums make their entry, there's a bit of movement in the curtain above her head. As the band all kick in together, the curtain is parted slightly, and two arses are exposed, framed seconds later by a spotlight, bouncing up and down in time with the song. She hasn't got a clue and is still waving her arms around being a tortured soul. The audience are cracking up at the anonymous arses. The rest of the set went without incident until the last bars of their final song, when the curtain at the back of the stage was pulled back to reveal 5 more bouncing arses. We feared a reprisal, but none came apart from Steph and Greg appearing halfway through our set, erecting a card table and chairs, setting up the cribbage board and dealing a couple of hands centre stage. The late inclusion of gigs meant that transportation between them could be difficult. We needed to get from Rotterdam to Toulouse, and it was proving a problem. Train meant at least a couple of connections, and the same applied to flying. Our accountant Tony DiCiaccio did a little maths, and it worked out it was cheaper to hire our own jet, so we did. During the flight there's a little negotiation between Tony D and the captain, and he gets us a deal for the remaining 2 flights. I think the captain liked the idea of a bit of rock and roll on his plane. It was the only time I've ever travelled in this manner, and it is definitely the way to go. No check-in or boarding cards or hanging about waiting for your flight to leave. The flight leaves when you get there. Drive up, get out the limo, get on the plane. You just cannot beat that. We arrived at the airport and jumped aboard. Champagne was offered but declined. We had a gig that night. It would have been wrong to indulge ourselves whilst Holly and Wolfgang were taking a couple of trains. We'd upset them both during our stay in Lille. We got a bit wasted and thought we'd get dressed as ghosts and go and haunt them. We burned eye holes in pillowcases and wore them on our heads. Holly thought we were dressed as the KKK when we were howling on his corridor, but there were no racist connotations. Someone did shout, "Come out, you Nazi bastard," but it was done in a mock frightening tone rather than anything malicious or threatening. We land in Toulouse and are met on the tarmac by a couple of cars and head off to the hotel and then on to do the gig. The next morning, the 4 of us are all sitting alone in the lobby waiting to be picked up and taken to our private jet to perform for the very last time, and it seemed like these few private minutes might be a good time to discuss our future. "Paul, what are you doing after all this?" says Mark. "I think I'm going to do my own stuff. What about you?" "Yeah, I think we're going to do our own thing as well," we mumbled together. Well, that was a cosy 2 minutes. It was good to know we had a plan. Shit, the ride was nearly finished. The arrogance of youth may have been enough to sustain the idea that the lads would go on to greater and better things in the future, but in reality I think we were all wondering what tomorrow would bring. We flew to Bordeaux and met behind the big fish for the last time. No disrespect to Bordeaux, but this was a shit place to end it all. Who'd want to end a career in Bordeaux? It should have been Liverpool or New York, Paris or Milan, Tokyo or Sydney. It should have been somewhere a little more grandiose than Bordeaux. It was no different from all the gigs since Wembley. No grand gestures, no final words, no group hug. Ped hit the drums and we walked out forever. It may have been in Bordeaux, but the audience were given a show worthy of any of the other cities I've mentioned above. They also got a couple of extra highlights. We told Tony Pope to spread the word amongst the crew that we'd written a song about Wolfgang and we were going to play it at the end of the set. We had written a song, but it wasn't about Wolfgang, it was about Tony. We finish a storming gig and come back on for the encore. As French John puts the guitar over my shoulder, I get a custard pie in my face. I walked out to the stage and immediately go arse over tip because there's olive oil all over the floor. The song we've written is called The Manager of the Band, to the tune of Another One Bites the Dust. Tosh was the big cheese, but we thought this would knock him down a peg. He took it in good humour. Before we started playing, the monitor guy had been dragged on stage by the crew and tied to the underside of the drum riser. Captain Popular, as he was called, was serenaded whilst he tried to extricate himself. "I said Captain, I said what? I said Captain, I said Popular." The tune morphed into Tosh's song. We finish that and take our bow. Our version of the stripper plays out of the PA and we think to ourselves, why the hell not? We all start stripping off our clobber and throwing it into the audience. And the raucous outro ended with all of us and members of the crew dancing from side to side with our asses out. It was over. There should have been a party or some sort of celebration, but apart from a couple of beers backstage, we were ushered out and onto the jet that was waiting to take us back to London. We came through immigration at Gatwick about 3 in the morning and sleepily fell into waiting cabs. This 5-year roller coaster had just run out of gas. No party, no fanfare, no tearful goodbye. I should have been somewhere exotic toasting the journey, on my way to being deliriously drunk and playing Remember When with my bandmates until the early hours. It was now the early hours, but I was pretty sober, and going home with Claire to sleep in my own bed.